Welcome to another episode of JTV. We're doing virtual interviews now. That's going to be the case, I suspect, for at least the next couple of weeks as we're dealing with the very serious challenge of the coronavirus pandemic. And we obviously want to continue to create content and we want to reflect on what's going on and discuss what's going on, both from how we handle this as human beings, but also there might be some interesting Jewish questions to ask in terms of how can we continue with Jewish practice and Jewish life when you're self-isolating and when you're at home. So to discuss some of these questions, we're joined again by Rabbi Zobin, who's been on the program many times, and we're delighted to have him again, who I assume is speaking to us from his home. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm in my home, isolated like everyone else, and managed to get a few minutes of quiet here in my study. So, Ollie, delighted to be back and speaking to you.
Well, I'm pleased to be able to give you a bit of downtime, a bit of solace. So I'm asking every guest that I have on this program during this pandemic and this crisis, what's front and center in your mind at the moment?
Wow, lots of things. I think first and foremost, like everyone else, I'm struggling to make sense of this. Who would have thought even a few days ago, and never mind a few weeks or months ago, that we would find ourselves in this situation? It's surreal. It feels like something out of science fiction. It's difficult to believe that it's really true, and it's frightening. It's unsettling. It leaves one unsure really of the basis of one's own personal well-being and health, the well-being and health of the near and dear, obviously our precious community, and society in general. Where are we and where is this going, and how are we going to emerge from this? How will this leave us in terms of our physical health, our emotional health, our spiritual health, and our financial well-being? Lots of questions about it. And I think, to me, that's in many ways, at least at the moment, the first and most important reflection I have on the situation. We're feeling confused, we're feeling uncertain, we're questioning whether we can cope and whether we can manage. And yet, in some respects, this is a little bit of a reality check. It's a reality check because in many ways, this is the truth of our existence. We sometimes forget how vulnerable we are as people and as a society. And it reminds us perhaps of those truths. We sort of think we're secure, we think we're safe, we think we're well established, but actually we're not. And at any moment, on a personal and societal level, things can change as radically as they just now have. And I think that's the first thought I have, that we sometimes build for ourselves an illusion of security and forget actually the fundamental vulnerability that lies behind so much of what we do. So that's one reflection, and linked to that is perhaps an opportunity for us to empathize and think about those who are vulnerable so much of the time, people who perhaps always live in a world that's a little confusing, that lurch from crisis to crisis, whether it's in terms of their inner life, their spiritual life, their mental well-being, or their finances, and perhaps so much of the time are truly so vulnerable. And maybe the experiences we're going through, which despite all the fear, ultimately we're so safe. We're in the security of our houses. Thank God we have enough to eat and drink, and we still have electricity. We still have communication using technology. And yet that little bit of uncertainty and insecurity we have perhaps can help us empathize and realize a little bit better what so many people are living with the whole time. So I think for me, those are the two primary thoughts that I have at this moment.
Absolutely. And I think what's so unprecedented about this challenge and this crisis is that it's touching so much, if not potentially all of the world and every human being. And it doesn't discriminate based on race, class, gender, And it's interesting what you said about it's sensitizing us to people's struggles who were going through struggles before this pandemic hit. I learned once that a rabbi told me once that there was a discussion in the Talmud about how did Job, how did he die? And he told me that one opinion is that it says actually it's a fictional story and he never actually existed. He wasn't an actual character. It's just a story that has morals to teach us about theodicy and other such things. And he told me that there was a rabbi, I think it might have been said in the name of Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, that he said that opinion, that he never existed, that's what killed him. That to deny someone suffering and not to actually for people to feel that no one actually listens to them and hears their pain and hears their suffering, that is a killer. And you're right in the sense that perhaps one thing that this can sensitize us to, and maybe one, I don't want to say a redeeming element of this crisis, but a comforting element, is that people feel like we're all in this together and that everyone understands each other's challenges to an extent because we're all touched by this.
I think that the distinction you just drew is an important one. It's certainly not for me to speculate as to why this is happening. I wouldn't even dare tread on the territory of putting forward reasons. And I wouldn't even say that it's hard to gauge what's a redeeming feature and what's, can we say that this extent of suffering and misery that so many are going through is somehow justified by this? I can't go near that. But what I can say is we are in this situation. And given that we are in this situation, what can we draw out of it? And we're all thinking about Pesach at this time of year. Every nation has a sort of story they tell, a foundational story about what they are as a people. You know, if you're English, we talk about William the Conqueror, the Battle of Hastings, perhaps the Magna Carta, the Blitz. And these are the stories that sort of form our sense of identity as Brits. And maybe if you're American, you talk about the Founding Fathers and Statue of Liberty and the Declaration of Independence and things like that. We as Jews, the founding story we tell about ourselves is that we were ex-slaves, that we were slaves, prisoners in Egypt, and we've now gone free. And the essence of being a slave is vulnerability. The essence of being a slave is not being in control of one's own fate, being uneducated, smelly, unhygienic, poor, unable, not in control of one's fate and one's destiny. And that's what it means to be a slave. And the reason why the story of Egypt is so central to this time of year, to Pesach, and the Pesach cleaning we're doing, and the Seder preparations we're making, and actually to so much else in the Torah. The Exodus of Egypt is at the heart of Shabbat. It's at the heart of the mezuzah that we have on our doorposts as we walk through the doorways. It's at the heart of the tefillin that we place on ourselves. So much is built around the story of Egypt because it's telling us that what it means to be a Jew is to be an ex-slave. To be a Jew isn't to be someone living comfortably in a leafy middle-class suburb. To be a Jew is someone who carries around with them in the essence of their identity that they are ex-slaves, that they were former slaves who were vulnerable, who are incapable, and to carry around the appreciation of the gift of life and security and freedom that we now have. And that means that as a Jew walks through life, and perhaps if we see someone who is in need, someone who's desperate, perhaps someone sleeping rough on the street, who isn't able, isn't capable, isn't wise, isn't educated, isn't even clean, we're meant to look at them and say, this person is a brother or a sister. This person is what we come from and what we are in our essence. And it seems to me this is a very central message of Judaism. The Torah itself 30 or 40 times reiterates, love the stranger because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. Love the vulnerable, the needy, those who are alone, those who are isolated, because you were once vulnerable, needy, alone and isolated in the land of Egypt. And Pesach calls upon us to reflect about this, and the coronavirus calls upon us to really reflect about this. And what you said was so absolutely true. We so much of the time sort of think that we have the achievements, the successes to our own credit. And there are people who are just as good as us and just as wonderful and just as nice and just as kind and just as capable, who have the misfortune of perhaps being born in the wrong part of the world, in the centers of civil war, whether it's in Syria or in Yemen, and are so decapacitated and so alone through no fault of their own. And this is definitely central to the message of Seder night and the message of Pesach, and definitely central to what we're meant to be really thinking about at the moment. I may have shared this with you before, and forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but when we think about just the mere act of turning on a tap of water in the morning, And as we wake up in the morning bleary-eyed and stagger to the bathroom and just turn the tap of water on and the water flows, just think about what's gone into allowing that to happen. So the water's flowing, clean water. It's clearly been flowing through the taps because of the water plant, because it's been cleansed and it's been through a filtration system, because it's been pumped by a pumping station. And then we think about what allows that to happen. Who built the water plant? Who provides the electricity for the pumping of the water, for the cleansing of the water? And then we think about the pipes, those metal pipes that bring the water to our tap, and the pipes that have been mined somewhere. And then there've been the ore, the metal ore that's been mined has been purified in plants running through electricity. And then what allows the electrical power stations to operate with the mining of the coal in distant lands, and perhaps the oil that's been drawn out of the deserts of Arabia and arrived through tankers on our shores. And before we know it, it's an underestimate to say it's not 1 million, it's not 10 million, it's 100 million people that have been possible just this simple act of water flowing through the taps when we turn the water on. And that's never mind the background, the police and the army, which allow a secure society, which is necessary for all enterprise to take place, and the street cleaners and the dustbin men and the sewage workers that allow us to live in hygienic parts of the world, and of course the hospitals and the medical profession. And before you know it, every moment of our life is only possible because many tens of hundreds of millions have made it possible. And if we think about a man like Bill Gates and what he's achieved, and we ask ourselves what percentage of his success is really down to his own achievement, we realize very fast, born in the right family, with an education, with a workforce that he can tap into, and with the security and health and hygiene and everything else that goes on around, it's an overestimate for any of us to pat ourselves on the back and say even 1% of our success is down to us. And I definitely think what we're going through now reminds us of that. And we're all in this together, absolutely. And we're reminded about how much of our success is really dependent on things that are beyond our control. Other human achievements, society as a whole, and of course the very gift of life, which we got from God, which is the other central theme of the Pesach story, the intervention of God in our lives and his existence, through which our existence is made possible. So yes, I think what you're saying is right, and this is definitely connected to the difficult experiences we're all going through at the moment.
I'd really like to tap into that final point you made, which is the contrast of we're extremely vulnerable on the one hand, we are ex-slaves, we know that, but on the other hand, the Torah is a story of God's intervention in our lives. And this is a question that I've never really fully had an answer for, which is basically, is the Torah there to tell us that life is going to be challenging, you're going to be vulnerable, and just cling to God through it? Or is it telling us, or is it telling us that not only should you cling to God through it, but by clinging to God through it, that will ease your suffering, God will take away your suffering. So for example, it says, if examples of, we say when we put the Torah away on Shabbat mornings, Darachecha, Darchei Noam, V'chol Nivosecha Shalom, that God, that the Torah's ways are ways of, peace and pleasantness, and, follow in that path, and God will provide for you. There's many instances where the Torah seems to say this, but on the other hand, I think of someone like Rabbi Akiva, who he kept everything. He was one of the greatest men of all time, and yet he was burned to death by the Romans. So what exactly is, how does it work? How does this covenant work?
Again, very good questions, and ones that need to be asked. There are different approaches to this in Jewish thinking, and I'll share with you perhaps the perspective of the Rambam, Maimonides, on the matter. And the first point to be made is that in his thinking, and indeed this seems quite clear when one looks at the Torah does not guarantee to us or offer us a promise of an easy and smooth life. Quite the contrary, it very much speaks about the idea that human beings face challenges, we face difficulties. It tells us the story of the lives of our greats, our forefathers, our foremothers, and very often very challenging and difficult lives. They didn't have smooth lives at all. On the contrary, in one remarkable line, the Talmud tells us that tzaddikim, righteous people, ein lahem menucha, they don't have rest and ease, not in this world and even not in the world to come. Because if life is about choices, and choices are about change, then by definition, we always need to be in motion. We always need to be moving. And moving means that if today I am here, tomorrow I am elsewhere. And if tomorrow I'm elsewhere, it means I'm no longer here. There's always a sacrifice built into that. Every second of life is a moment of new life, but also a bereavement and a loss of the experiences in the life that I had just moments before. And that's the essence of what it means to be alive. And life, only when life ceases does one cease to lose and cease to suffer loss. So the Torah doesn't hold out guarantees or promises of an easy life and a smooth life. Quite the contrary. It tells us that life sometimes will be challenging. And yes, that trite expression, challenges are to be embraced. That's all we can do. It also tells us that we're not in control of our fate. It tells us that belief in God doesn't mean some sort of mystical affirmation that somehow we have the magical insight to read always history with clarity or to know what's going to be. And sometimes attempting to do so is misunderstanding actually the message that lies behind it, which is that we're not always in control of our fate. So what can we do about that? How can we approach this? And here I want to use an analogy. It's really the Rambam's analogy, Maimonides' analogy, but I'll just give a modern version of it. And he says that we need to go through life, and perhaps this is the greatest truth that we human beings can know. We need to go through life aware that every second of life is a free gift, unearned. We don't have a right to life. It's a gift that's being given to us. And this can come across in a very heavy way and in a depressing way, but it also can be a life-affirming way. And let me just give you a little analogy. If imagine one's skydiving and one jumps out of the plane and one pulls the cord and the parachute doesn't open. And one pulls again and it still doesn't open. And one realizes after a few sinking moments that it's not going to open. So what does one do at that point? One's plummeting to earth. One's only got a few minutes left till one lands. And the Rambam would say, well, just experience those next 3 minutes. Live those 3 minutes, because what else can you do? That's all you've got. Use those 3 minutes for something good. Enjoy the view. Meditate upon God. Appreciate those few minutes of life. Now, this is a very tough and stark message, but the truth is we have no choice but to embrace it, because all of us are in that planet, in that skydive where the parachute hasn't opened. All of us are in that experience where hopefully it's not 3 minutes, it's 3 decades or more, 120 years on Earth. But ultimately, the parachute isn't going to close and we're going to land. And therefore, the most we can do is just appreciate those free gifts of life. And this isn't meant to be depressing. We're meant to wake up every morning with the words of thanks on our lips, Moda ani lefanecha, and look at the end of our bed and see a pile, an enormous heap of presents. And the heap of presents are the seconds that we have today. But now let's use them and enjoy them fully, because every moment of life is a gift that's got granted to us. And again, perhaps we only appreciate that when life is threatened. And this is a very sad thing. Torah is meant to be a consciousness-raising system. It's meant to allow us to appreciate that which we have before it's taken away from us. You know, we all have that experience sometimes in which one's had a cold and perhaps a sore throat and a blocked nose and one's just feeling rotten. And then one day one wakes up and the sore throat is gone and one's able to breathe again through one's nose. And one just feels so alive and happy to be alive and appreciative of being alive. And every breath one takes is just a sheer pleasure for the first few days after that cold is over. And then we get back to normal life and we forget how much pleasure there is in breathing. And one way of looking at the Torah is it's meant to be a consciousness-raising system. It's meant to allow us to notice the gifts of life, not when they're threatened and they might be taken away from us, but when we have them every minute. The Talmud tells us, Kol neshama tahalelka, that Kol neshima neshima, on every breath we take, we ought to be able to thank God. Imagine what life would be like if every breath we took, we could enjoy the experience of breathing and savor it. And so much of the time we don't appreciate the working of our body, our livers and our kidneys that are constantly performing duty unnoticed and unappreciated, until, God forbid, our health or the health of someone near and dear to us is threatened. And the Torah is trying to teach us to go through life noticing and appreciating its blessings. This is the concept of saying a bracha, a blessing on food, before we have it. Rather than just eating it without noticing it, we stop and for a few moments we reflect and we meditate. And we look at that delicious fruit we have in our hands. And perhaps we think about how much work went into allowing us to have that simple orange, which has been imported from a faraway land and grown by a faraway farmer who we'll never meet. And this is the concept of making a blessing, a bracha, before we eat it, to allow us to experience life at those moments in a true manner and appreciate those gifts of those precious but finite seconds that we have. And this is what the Torah means when it tells us again and again, choose life. The choice we face as human beings is, do we want to drift through life unaware, not noticing the gifts? Or do we want to experience every moment conscious that this is a gift given to us altruistically by an all-giving God? And this is one way of interpreting what the Torah means when it promises us bracha, blessing in our lives. It's telling us that we can make the choices about what we see and what we experience in life. In the Rambam's thinking, it's not some form of externalized intervention of a God who's constantly tweaking the course of history and the course of the world that's bringing bracha and blessing into our lives. But it's because God in his infinite wisdom built into the system of life that if we live a life of meaning and values, then we will see blessing, we will see bracha in our lives. And that means both in the perspective that we bring to it, and also ultimately in the functioning of society. A society that views the world as the random fluctuations of an indifferent universe, a world in which there is no absolute moral and value, and no absolute truth even, a universe which is indifferent to human existence, a society which embraces decadence and materialism, is a society which will tear itself apart. Built into the system of how God designed this world is that we human beings need meaning and purpose and a sense of spirituality and awareness that we're not just physical beings, but that we're spiritual beings. Built into the system is only through that can we live a life which flourishes and which is truly blessed. So in direct answer to your question, what does it mean when the Torah promises us blessing if we keep the Torah? In the Rambam's thinking, it means two things. It will allow us to see the blessing in our lives, and it will allow us ultimately to build a society which allows bracha, blessing, to flourish. Because if we don't choose life, then we're choosing death. We're choosing decadence, we're choosing materialism, we're choosing a life empty of values, and that isn't a life that can allow society to flourish. It's not a life that can allow society to be blessed. Do individuals have a guarantee of living a rich physical life, a material life, if they keep the Torah? Clearly not. There are those who prosper, and there are those who don't. But if we want as humans to be able to have a life of blessing, if we want to build a society that has a hope of blessing, then Torah is telling us we need to embrace spirituality and meaning and purpose in our lives. Otherwise, we will descend into decadence and destruction.
Well, it's very powerful. And I've heard some other rabbis, perhaps from other streams, maybe like the Breslov worldview philosophy, which says that, or seems to argue that one way of viewing challenges in people's lives is it's sort of like God is knocking at the door, asking us to become appreciative of what we already have, asking us to talk to him, to engage in him. And do you think that, do you personally, what do you think of the view that if you do sort of step up to that task, then God doesn't need to give a person as much or is able to take that challenge away? I know the flip side of the danger of that is you can sometimes end up victim blaming people, basically, when they're going through challenges and saying you need to do more. So what do you make of such a worldview?
I think you're right to say that there are different views in Judaism about these matters, but I don't think that there is a sustainable view that can argue that only those that suffer must somehow be to blame for their suffering. I think we can look at greats in history, in recent history, who suffered the tragedies of Jewish persecution in the last century and over the last millennia. We can look at the greats that we're told about going back in time, the lives of the forefathers and foremothers, the lives of the great Talmudic sages, and we can see those that had lives which were easier and those who went through very difficult and hard experiences. And I think that every authentic movement in Judaism needs to recognize that Moshe himself, the prophet who experienced God like no other human has, left unanswered the question about the righteous suffering and the wicked prospering. And the idea that somehow perfect righteousness guarantees an easy and only positive life simply isn't one that is true. Suffering in the classic literature can happen because of punishment, but it can also happen because of a predetermined life experience that one's meant to have. It could be this is the story of one's life, and one needs to deal with the experiences in the best possible way. And sometimes suffering can be given as a growth opportunity, and even as almost a privilege and a chance to use it for that which is positive. And therefore, the most we can say is appreciate every moment of life whilst we have it. Appreciate the gift of life. Express our appreciation to God. Use it well and use it for purpose. And perhaps also express the love that we feel to those who are near and dear to us now while we still have the opportunity. Because what this brings out to us and what the Rambam is arguing is that every moment of life is precious. Every moment of life is an undeserved gift, and we don't know when it will stop. And therefore, the most we can say is appreciate what we have, use it to draw close to God, and use it to draw close to our fellow human beings, to express that love whilst we have the opportunity.
And is there no value? Are you? I mean, I presume you're not saying. I presume you're not saying that there's no value towards introspection, prayer, evaluating one's deeds when they experience suffering. As far as I understand it, the Talmud itself says that one should do that. Not to say necessarily that someone is being punished when they're experiencing a suffering. It might not be, but that it doesn't hurt. Perhaps it's saying that. What would you say to that?
Absolutely, one should use a difficult time as a chance for introspection, a chance for teshuvah, repentance, and improvement. But this isn't because one's looking backwards and trying to speculate about why this has happened and claim some near prophetic insight into why this thing has happened and why the world runs the way it is. It's more about being forward-facing and saying, I'm going through this difficult time. It's a wake-up call to me to think about whether I'm using every moment of life in the best possible way. It's forward-looking rather than backward-looking. It's saying this has happened. That which I held precious, that which I took for granted, I've been reminded cannot be taken for granted. And now how can I use it to the best? And it's incidentally for this reason that the classic mourner's prayer, the Kaddish, if one look at its content, doesn't say much about the past. It isn't a memorial prayer in which we look at the past. It's very much forward focused. It's saying, I've suffered this loss, this has happened. Now, how can I make the world a better place? How can I make the world a more kosher place, a place that better reflects the values of spirituality and morality and holiness which Judaism subscribes to? So I think you are correct. Absolutely, the classic sources say something that's difficult that happens, you fash feish b'masav. Look at one's deeds, do introspection, but it's about, at least according to the Rambam, being forward-looking in working out how can I improve, how can I learn from this experience, rather than just backwards-looking in trying to speculate about why this happens and what the workings of the divine plan are.
And what would you say, I mean, not just necessarily in Judaism, but throughout all religions, right now, what do you think are some of the wrong religious responses are to this crisis that we should be very careful to avoid?
I think we've mentioned some of them. I think that speculating about which particular spiritual failure is the cause of this, number one, so much of the time ends up in blaming others rather than looking at ourselves. And number two, seeks to offer to us a false reassurance that we're in control of the situation. If there's one lesson to learn from what's going on, it's that we are not in control. And we run so much of our lives to the experts. We run to the economists who are convinced can somehow cancel the cyclical nature of the economy. We run to doctors and scientists who can conquer the world and sort every problem out. But we can also make the mistake of running to pseudo-spiritual teachers who can somehow give us mystical insight into what's going on. And through that, we can control the levers of history. And if we do that, the tragedy of it is we're missing the true spiritual insight which we're meant to get from this situation, which is that we're not the masters of the universe. There is a master of the universe, God, and we are his creatures, his creations, who should appreciate and savor every moment of life that we're given, but be conscious that it's a gift freely given, but not a gift that we have a right to. And that calls upon us, therefore, to build a relationship with God, a relationship with ourselves, and a relationship of kindness, imitating God towards others.
A question related to this topic and related to our entire conversation right now. People are right now, as you say, feeling more vulnerable. They're more concerned about losing loved ones, just seeing death rates rise. Even if you don't know anyone, seeing all these death rates rise every day throughout the world is troubling. Do you think it's a good thing to think about death and our mortality? And even if I suspect you'll say, yes, it is a good thing. Is it a good thing to think about it regularly? Because I wonder whether, in a sense, if you really come to terms with it, it might liberate you. But there's also the danger that it could perhaps depress you.
It's a very good question. We've spoken in this conversation about mortality, and I think that some of the time perhaps we're in denial about the reality of our existence, and I don't think that's ever good. I think being honest and truthful about our condition is important. And we sometimes try and cover up from ourselves in the West some of the hard, brutal reality of life. We don't like remembering that so much of our wealth and the clothes that we wear are built on the back of extreme poverty in the third world. And we outsource the suffering into the faraway lands so we don't need to see it up close. We sometimes don't like seeing people sleeping rough in our nice, comfortable middle-class areas, and we want them to be moved off the streets so that they're out of sight and mind. We don't like realizing that our life is still dependent on people that work the soil, that still get dirt under their fingernails. We like imagining that food arrives vacuum packed in the kosher kingdom or at the click of the mouse from an Amazon order. And I think that being in denial about the rough and tumble nature, the reality of what it means to be a human and how we have finite existence here on earth is not a healthy thing. You know, shechita, the ritual slaughter of animals, gets a lot of bad press. And one of the reasons it gets bad press is because it just looks very bloody. It's very messy. It doesn't mean that in truth it's a cruder way of killing an animal than the bolt to the brain, which just causes a slow death to the animal. But in pictures and imagery, it looks very harsh. And it may well be that this is part of the reason why the Torah wants us to kill an animal that way, to realize and recognize that we're taking a life at that moment, and that this is a significant achievement, and one we only have the right to do if we do it with care and if we live up to our responsibility as human beings. And therefore, sometimes being in denial about mortality and denial about the roughness of life is not a healthy thing. Now, does this need to be depressing? I don't think so. I think it's part of the reality of life, and therefore it's something that we need to come to terms with. And as I've tried to explain, it can be life affirming. It can be a reminder to appreciate every second of the gift of life that we have. The other thing to mention over here is, of course, that in terms of Jewish thinking, we don't believe that death is the end. We speak about the soul, the neshama. These are sometimes mystical terms that are hard to relate to, but we can equally talk about consciousness. And we believe that ultimately consciousness survives after death. Now, this is a view that somehow often feels, it's one that we don't always feel comfortable speaking about. But we human beings, the most basic fact we know about our existence is that we are conscious. And one of the mysteries of our existence is that in truth, it's the only thing that we know about ourselves. Everything we experience from the external world, from the material world, could be an illusion. As Descartes famously taught us, it's just the fact of our own consciousness, which is the only truth we can hold on to. So we know we're conscious, but we have no idea about how consciousness interacts with the physical world.
It's very scary to think about.
It's possible that our physical brains and bodies somehow give rise to consciousness, and as the physical body deteriorates, our consciousness deteriorates with it. But we have no idea how that mechanism would work. How can a combination, a complex arrangement of ultimately physical material of neurons give rise to consciousness, to that sense of I, to the inner knowledge I have that I am an experiencer? We have no idea about that. And it's equally possible that our physical brains and bodies are the interface through which our consciousness interacts with the world. But that as they deteriorate, the interface deteriorates. But upon death and the removal of our physical bodies, our consciousness still continues. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine every human being was born with goggles permanently over their eyes. And we witnessed that as these goggles became scratched, our eyesight deteriorated. And someone told you one day that if the goggles were completely removed, our eyesight would be restored. So we'd say that's impossible. Clearly, it's the goggles that give rise to eyesight. And we see that as they deteriorate, our eyesight deteriorates. But in fact, we know that model is wrong. The goggles are simply the interface through which our vision we can see and experience vision. And if the goggles are removed, then the vision is restored. And similarly, it's true that we witness that with the deterioration of the body and the brain, our minds and consciousness's ability to interact with the outside deteriorates. but we have no reason to think that consciousness itself deteriorates also. And therefore, we quite simply have two models of consciousness. It's possible that the physical body and the brain can rise to the mind into consciousness, and it's equally possible that consciousness exists independently and simply interacts through our physical body. And Judaism adopts that latter model, and there's nothing illegitimate philosophically or scientifically about that worldview. It adopts that model and it argues that our consciousness survives, that we have within ourselves this sense of our infinite existence, this sense of the possibility that we as humans can touch that which is divine, that which is infinite. And one of the ways we can do that are through acts of kindness and meaning and absolute worth and morality. The little acts of kindness that we do can be something that can touch upon the infinite and touch upon true meaning, and therefore can remain forever. And therefore, the second reason why us coming to terms with our mortality and physical mortality is healthy and positive is because it reminds us that we humans can rise above mere physical existence. We can be beings which are little less than divine. We can be beings that can touch that which is infinite, that which is immortal, that which is eternal, by doing acts of eternal godly value, by imitating God, by doing acts of morality and kindness. And therefore, for both those reasons, I think it is healthy for us to recognize our mortal limitations, because it's part of the reality of life. There's no point being in denial about that, because it doesn't need to be depressing, because it can remind us to appreciate the gift of life, and because it reminds us that we humans are capable of rising above the limitations of physical existence and achieving immortality if we make the right choices and touch upon immortality in the way we live.
Would you feel the same way if you were talking to someone who was an atheist that didn't believe in an afterlife? Would you tell them better not to think about it?
I think that many of those who think that they don't believe in God, as long as they still believe in absolute values, also are buying into the belief that there are things of absolute infinite worth. And as long as you buy into the idea that there are things of real moral value, of real spiritual achievement, then in some levels, we are fellow travelers. It would be far better, of course, if it was understood that this is about a real relationship to a God who cares about us, who loves us, and has given us the gift of life. But ultimately, anyone who recognizes that we humans can achieve things of absolute worth is part of infinite godly existence, whether they know it or not.
Wow, fascinating. One of the last things I want to talk to you about, because I know you've got another class to go to soon, is Pesach, Passover. And this is going to be, in many ways, it's very sad, but it will be a very historic Pesach this year, given that so many Jewish people are going to be, they're not going to be able to go to synagogue, they're not going to, some people might struggle to get all the food and things that they'll require, some people might not be able to be with family and loved ones. It's going to be very challenging. And I want to just talk through with you some of the halachic, legal sort of Jewish law implications. Just to run through a couple of things, and you can tell me your thoughts on them. Number one, I've heard some people talking about live streaming Seder nights for especially families do it, and then so that means their elderly can see it. But is that something that might be there might maybe some leniency on? Second question is, I've seen that at least in London, it's the London Beth Din has now given a whole list of foods that are now don't require a kosher for Passover label, and some people are a bit sort of confused. Why couldn't I get that in previous years? And so is this just they're being a bit more lenient for because of the situation we're in, and that it's not really the ideal? Question number three is the final one is, it's not so much, I understand we can't have minyans, for example, where you have 10 men present praying together. This is more actually not a halachic question, but a spiritual question. Just, is it quite spiritually significant that the world no longer has Jewish communal prayer? I don't know what they're doing actually in Israel, but it seems like we're losing it. I mean, I know we say there's this concept that the world cannot exist without Torah study, and is there something troubling? Is there something potentially spiritually vulnerable for the world not to have communal prayer going on?
Okay, three important questions. I'll try and address them one by one. Firstly, and I think this needs to be said before I say anything else, it's a terrible and painful situation. And the reality is, this year there will be those who are alone for the Seder, and it doesn't bear contemplating about over. We open our Seder every year with Kol Dichfin, with an invitation to everyone to be welcome. And this year, we have been advised medically that that is simply not safe. And I'll use this opportunity to appeal to everyone and to make this as clear as possible. All of us have received medical advice. We cannot invite to our homes this year people, particularly those who are vulnerable physically, those who are more elderly or have medical conditions. But really, we cannot invite anyone to our homes this year. And if there's a case-by-case exception, in particular scenarios of extreme fragility or mental health and so on, this obviously needs to be discussed with a competent medical professional on a one-by-one basis. But in general, the rule is we can't invite, and that is a terrible situation to be in. In terms of the Zoom Seder, whether we can use something, a social media or something to create link-ups between different people who are celebrating their Seder separately, my halachic view, and the view of, I think, almost all rabbis that look at this, is that electricity is not allowed on, one's not allowed to operate and create changes in electrical use on Shabbat or Yom Tov. There were 100 years of discussion around this when electricity first came out, but this year has been extensively thrashed out, and this is the consensus that has arisen.
But what about security cameras at synagogues?
Deliberately causing change to a circuit through speaking into or through Zoom and changing the imagery and so on is not allowed. Now, security cameras that operate, we have no particular interest in the security camera catching us as legitimate citizens going around our business. We want it to catch criminals or to protect us in a situation of genuine danger and pikuach nefesh. This is a completely different scenario to where we have a Zoom link set up where we are deliberately unconsciously speaking through it or at it because we want someone else to experience that which we're doing. And it doesn't appear to me that there is a general halachic leniency or allowance for this. Having said that, on a case-by-case basis, situations in which people will be alone, perhaps isolated for 2 days or 3 days of Yom Tov, or even 1 day of Shabbat, of course a question should be asked of a competent rabbi. There may be situations where it's simply not safe, whether because of the physical or mental well-being of someone, to leave them out of contact for a day, how much more so 3 days, and therefore questions should be asked. But that's a far cry from however much we would desperately want that, to allowing Zoom or the like to be used simply to allow people to have company and not to be alone at the Seder. It doesn't bear contemplating what it means for families to be apart over the Seder, for grandparents not to be able to be with their grandchildren, or indeed for people who are alone to have to keep the Seder by themselves. But that doesn't offer an allowance of threat to physical or mental well-being to give a default permission for Zoom to be used. Electricity and deliberate change of electrical circuitry is not allowed in halacha. Though, of course, on a case-by-case basis, it could be there's what to discuss if people are in genuinely situations of threat to well-being. I think it's also important to mention in this context that we're not just talking, when we talk about using social media to connect for the Seder, we're not just talking about an abstract halachic discussion, but we're talking about something that is integral to what Shabbat and Yom Tov are about. This isn't just another area of halacha, but this is an area where the halachic consensus that arose over the last 100 years of discussion has actually proven to be essential to what Shabbos is about. And it's remarkable to think about, because dry halachic discussions 100 plus years ago, perhaps dealing with 15-watt light bulbs in hovels in East Europe or in North Africa, when no one dreamt that the use of electricity would eventually result in the crazy world of social media and email that we live within, and that would prove essential to the electronic detox that is Shabbos. And yet somehow the halachic system discussing these very far removed use of electricity, when perhaps looking at it, one might have thought that actually allowing the use of electricity, quite the contrary, would enhance the experience of Shabbos, has now proven to be actually the essence of what Shabbos is about. And to me, this is a remarkable example of where the pond that was dropped, the stone that was dropped into the pond at Sinai, is still giving off ripples that we can hear to this day. And it's as if a ripple of Sinai was heard through all the great poskim over the last 100 years, who heard this voice coming out of Sinai saying, "Thou shalt not use electricity on Shabbos." And this is integral to what Shabbos is about. And if we think of ourselves as Orthodox Jews who care and engage with the modern world, it's obvious that in modernity, the prohibition of Shabbos is not, of electricity on Shabbat, is not something that we can afford to weaken. I should mention here also that the Ramban and Nachmanides stresses that beyond the prohibitions of Shabbos, there's another word used by the Torah about Shabbos, that it should be Shabbaton. It should be a Shabbos atmosphere. And this, the Ramban says, is a Torah law, left to the application of the scholars and sages of each generation to work out what the Shabbos atmosphere is about. But if we know anything about what Shabbos atmosphere is about, it's about being. It's about being centered and central. It's not about distracting ourselves and being drawn all over the place. That's why we're not allowed to ride on bikes on Shabbos that take us far away. They're vehicles, they're means of transport. A kid can go on a scooter, and that can be a toy. But for an adult, a bike is about travel, is about going out of themselves, rather than being in their place, being earthed and centered. Shabbos is about being, not about doing. And there's no better example of the contradiction to being and something that would drag us away from Shabbos than social media. It's the vehicle that pulls us out of being focused and centered on where we are. And therefore, there's no doubt that the prohibition of social media is really central to what Shabbos is about. The use of electricity is a technical violation of Shabbos in this form, and also a violation of the prohibition of Shabbos and the atmosphere of Shabbos that's so precious to us. And therefore, in the name of not just Torah and halacha, but also the application of halacha to those of us who care about how it's applied to modernity, this isn't some enhancement of the use of technology and modernization. So quite the contrary, is not recognizing how Shabbos needs to be applied in the modern age. So what is the answer? It's about priorities. It's about understanding that as painful as it is this year for people to be alone, not to be able to celebrate their Seder with their grandparents or their grandchildren, not to be able to be with their families, but this is the correct thing. This is the correct decision that needs to be made. Our adherence to halacha and the halachic system and Shabbos and Yom Tov above all is what's kept us together as a people and as Jews. And as soon as we weaken our commitment, ultimately that is what weakens our ability to transmit that which is so precious to us. And therefore the best and deepest way of us connecting with our families, with our grandchildren, with our community, with our nation, is by keeping this commitment to Shabbos and Yom Tov strong, even this year when it means that the Seder so tragically and painfully may need to be celebrated alone. Exception, of course, if this is risk to life and limb, if this could threaten physical or mental well-being, in which case it needs to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. But otherwise, this is the way we need to celebrate Pesach this year, by looking after ourselves and by committing to Shabbos and Yom Tov through adhering to strict policy in how we treat electricity. In terms of food standards and the London Beit-Din allowances this year, I just want to use an analogy from other areas of life. And halacha really operates in the same way. There are standards of food hygiene set by the department responsible for food hygiene, which are the highest standards of food care, and we would expect those to be kept. It doesn't mean that one can't get away with eating food that for which the standards haven't been kept or a lower bar has been set, but it simply means it's not the same quality. We seek quality in terms of the taste of the food that we eat, and we seek quality in terms of the health and the standards that are set for that. And it's exactly the same in our spiritual lives. We should seek quality in our spiritual lives, and halacha mandates of us, demands of us to have a high quality of halachic observance, to enrich our lives and engage with Judaism as fully as possible. Equally, though, there can be situations which will accept lower quality of food. In the current isolation, we're not able to buy our bespoke and cuisine that we might always appreciate, and we accept lower qualities of physical food. And similarly, the Beit-Din, quite rightly, has allowed a lower quality of halachic practice, even though this isn't the gold standard, generally speaking. Halacha is a graduated system, and it's appropriate and right for each halachic authority, each kashrut authority, and each leader of the community to set what is an appropriate bar for their community in terms of halachic standards that are kept, in much the same way as we do in every other area of our physical and medical and health well-being. We discuss often how there are multiple faces to the Torah, how competing views in halacha always have some legitimacy. And again, in normative times, it makes sense to follow the mainstream opinion, but there could be times in which a minority opinion is also a legitimate one, again, much the same as in debates in science and medicine and other areas of life. So this is why the Beit Din on this occasion has adopted a lower standard, which is appropriate and right under the circumstances, but it doesn't mean that we should accept for the rest of our lives that we're going to live just like we wouldn't live physically in isolation and accepting the lower standards of comfort and well-being and communication and social contact that we have. We don't want to be permanently locked into our corona life. Similarly, we don't want to be permanently locked into a halachic corona life. We're locked up in our rooms and our houses physically and also halachically, but that doesn't mean that that's the standard of living that we should choose spiritually or physically the rest of the time. Now, of course, all of this is within legitimate views expressed by expert poskim looking at halachic issues, whether about kashrut or something else. But within the acceptable range of halachic views, it certainly makes sense generally to follow the majority opinion or the opinion that holds one to an acceptable high halachic standard. But equally, it's appropriate, as the Beit Din has done on this occasion, to follow more lenient views or occasionally even minority opinions at difficult times, as long as these are within the realm and range of acceptable and legitimate expert halachic advice. Thirdly, you asked about minyan and the cessation of minyanim. Again, this is heartbreaking. It's painful. But what can we take out of it? We can take out of it how halacha puts human life ahead of everything else. And it's entirely appropriate that we should realize that now the mitzvah, the halachic obligation upon us, is to look after our well-being and not to attend minyanim, even though we may desperately want to do so. Perhaps it's a reminder for us to value minyan and tefillah, prayer and prayer gatherings and community when we can have them. And so much of the time, perhaps we spend complaining about community and communal politics and things that are going on. This is a reminder to us how precious and valuable our botik nesiot are, our synagogues, our places of gatherings are. It's a reminder of how precious and valuable it is to be able to get together for davening. And sometimes we don't appreciate it. Sometimes we spend our time talking through davening or not engaging properly and meaningfully through it. And this is a reminder to us, now that it is threatened, how much we should value this. This isn't a reason for what's happened, but it's certainly a meditation, a reflection that we can engage in now that we don't have it. And thirdly, perhaps it gives us the chance to do a different sort of tefillah. So much of the time when we're in shul, maybe we don't have the time and the leisure to read the English translation, to think about what the tefillah, the prayer really means, to engage with it in a calm, reflective space. And therefore, let's use this as a time to strengthen different sort of prayer, which we often can't get because we engage communally, and therefore engage in tefillah b'yechidot and tefillah by ourselves, thinking about tefillah in a different sort of way. And this is definitely a time when we need to strengthen in prayer. This is definitely a time when it's appropriate for us to call out to God. Prayer has three parts. One part of it is recognition of the power, the infinite ability of God. A second part of it is request, asking God to help us. And a third part of it is thanking him for that which we have. And definitely this time, when things aren't so simple, when things aren't so easy, it's a time for us to remind ourselves of God's power and ability, to thank him for that which we have, and to ask him to look after us as we go forward. So tefillah, prayer, absolutely should still go on.
But just on that last point, do you think that is there some kind of mystical concept or spiritual concept that perhaps the world is more vulnerable without communal prayer? That was really the heart of my question.
The world is more vulnerable without prayer and without communal prayer. The mystics would explain it mystically. The Rambam will explain it simply because we humans aren't getting together and getting that which prayer is meant to give us and that which is meant to achieve, a chance for reflection, a chance for connection to ourselves and connection to each other, connection to God. And we have lost those opportunities. So we are definitely the poorer for the lack of prayer. But at the end of the day, we are taught again and again, Rachmana liba boi. The real depth of tefillah is our heart, is what we're putting into it. So if we can't have the external communal strength in number that communal prayer gives us, we can enrich it with a greater depth and a greater heart, and that can make up and more than make up for it. So yes, let's strengthen our tefillah, give it more heart, and that way we can still engage properly with tefillah and with the strength that tefillah gives us, whether it's mystically or spiritually, even though we don't have the chance for communal prayer.
Well, Rabbi Zobin, thank you so much for your insights, for making the time to do this. It's greatly appreciated this time, all the previous times you've been on the programme. It's greatly appreciated. I wish you a happy and healthy Pesach, and we look forward to having you on again in the future.
Thank you, Ollie. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak. And I wish you and all the viewers happy and kosher Pesach. And please God, we should all be able to celebrate in good health this Pesach and many more festivals going forward. I wish you well.
Amen. Thank you.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.